I'm Sarah Axelbaum, and an uplifter is someone who inspires kindness in other people.
It brings me great joy to nominate Laura Kavanagh. She was the 34th Fire Commissioner of the Fire Department in the city of New York. But even more so, she's smart and creative and has learned to be an excellent leader and to be authentic and to walk with integrity. She's somebody that I can talk to for hours and leave thinking new thoughts and learning new things. And I'm just so grateful that I get to have her in my life. And I'm delighted to share her with the rest of you.
You just heard the Reverend Ann Cansfield from episode 26 introducing her nominee for the Uplifters podcast, Laura Kavanagh, the first woman to serve as the New York City Fire Commissioner in the FDNY's 157-year history. Now, here's what you don't know. Anne, who is truly one of the most inspiring, incredible, brilliant people I've ever talked to, had no idea that she was making one of my dreams come true by nominating and introducing me to Laura. When we started dreaming up the Uplifters podcast, we made a short list of 10 women that we would be most excited to talk to. I'm not even going to tell you what Laura and I talk about in this episode because it was so much better than I even imagined. And I don't want to use up a single second of your attention just chattering at you when you could be hearing directly from Laura herself. Okay, let's go. I'm really glad you're here. You are a trailblazer and a pioneer, and you are somebody who has sat in a seat that no other woman has sat in before you. But that's not why Anne nominated you. She nominated you because you're her lifeline and the person she would call if her kids were in trouble, and the person she trusts and relies on for advice and support and inspiration. And she's a person who's surrounded by a lot of amazing people. So I hope it felt meaningful to you to be seen in that way. It made me even more excited to talk to you, that's for sure.
No, I think Anne saying that I was a great emergency contact person, maybe not for a lot of people would that be flattering, but I'm really into practical and not into sort of like flowery. So like to me, to be the most practical person to take care of her kids, who I also adore, was very flattering. When you add Jen, her wife, the trained therapist, they're quite the team. I always tell them they could solve any problem, spiritual, psychological.
When I asked you who you had nominated, it was a problem solver.
Yep. My go-to network person, knows everyone or knows the solution, who to talk to.
I think we don't talk enough about the importance of those people in our lives, but also a belief that problems can be solved.
Yeah, I also think a belief you don't have to do it all by yourself. I do think that's a mistaken, maybe idea of leaders, but also something it tends to be gendered. Women tend to think like, I have to fix it all. And one of the things I've had the benefit is like a front row seat to how an all male world works. One thing I can tell you is they always rely on their network. That's a very strong part of what they do. So the idea that you don't have to fix it all yourself, that to call someone else and ask for their guidance is as much fixing it as it is to take out a hammer and nail and do it yourself.
That's such an interesting point, because I don't think of that as a gendered issue. Because as women, we are more community oriented, if anything.
Agreed. We are more community oriented. We certainly have bigger networks. I think we tend to rely on those networks for emotional support, and that's critical. But one thing I really noticed that men do, and again, I sort of hate to say any of this is gendered. You could find an exception, but one of the interesting aspects of being at the fire department is it being so heavily male, 99% male. You can't sort of help but see things gendered. It's also a very traditional place. So gender is still very traditionally considered. In a place like that, it doesn't actually just give you a view of being a woman there. It gives you a view of what an all-male world is like, because it is all men. There are things I've learned from them about how they work. I mean, even if you think about it in other contexts, like people talk about Ivy League colleges and how that's really about networking and getting your sons jobs and brothers jobs. It's really the same thing. Men just tend to see friendships as very tactical. I think they're missing the emotional part, although actually the fire department, they have some pretty close relationships. But I do think it's a thing I've learned is every time I confront a problem that I think I don't have the answer to this and what am I going to do? Or it's keeping me awake at night. I'm like sitting with it just by myself. There is no point in which I've put it out to my network and not found someone who not only could solve the problem, but almost made it easy. Like I wondered, why did that keep me awake for 3 nights? Or why did I spend 2 hours on Google trying to fix it? It's a good lesson learned. There's always somebody with an answer.
Yeah. And we don't have to do anything alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody at the fire department does anything alone. It's the ultimate team experience. They literally live together, work together. They don't go, you're not going to see a firefighter going rogue and going to a fire by himself. That's, not the way they work. So they've taught me a lot.
That's so interesting. So when did you join the fire department?
2014. So about a decade ago. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. Hard to imagine.
So really probably at the very beginning of your adult life.
I had a career for about 10 years in campaigns and elections before that. So you could say my career in public life is about 20 years long. The first half was spent in campaigns. And I didn't intend to go to the fire department. That was a very sort of serendipitous new path for me. But I had very distinctly gotten tired of campaigns, to be honest. And it sounds sort of quaint to say now, but I thought that they'd become too mean. And I really wanted, not only too mean, but there's something exciting about electing someone you care about when you're a young person and seeing them bring change. But what can happen when you do that over and over is you think, do I really know how to enact that change? Because when you're campaigning, you're only talking about it. You don't actually have to do the hard work of figuring out how it gets done, which is often, both are hard, but it's often more complicated how we get the things we want done. And so I made a very distinct choice after about a decade of that to say I wanted to go into government and actually had been looking for government jobs. I ended up working for Bill de Blasio on his, at that time, 7th place mayoral campaign and was interviewing for jobs in the Bloomberg administration concurrently. And he knew that. I had told him that government was what was next for me. And obviously that turned out to work out very well because he became mayor and he knew about my desire to, not stay on the campaign side and to go into government. And it was actually he who had suggested the fire department, who was at the time settling a major decades-long discrimination lawsuit. And he knew that was something that I cared about. It's something when I was in political life, like getting first-time candidates elected to office was one of the things I worked on, getting outsider candidates elected, and also just general operations. So like figuring out why something is wrong and how to fix it was sort of my forte. And in particular, helping to get, non-traditional voices into public life was already where I had a passion. But when he said the fire department, I was stunned. He talked about the lawsuit. He talked about their plans to settle that lawsuit and how so much of that work would be about not only operations, like overhauling, not fire operations, operations of the agency, overhauling the way they did things like hiring and data collection, but also that it would be about helping to get first generation candidates into the department.
Wow. And so what role did you enter the force in?
So I started as, I think, the assistant commissioner for external affairs. A large part of it was really figure out how this lawsuit is actually going to work once it's settled. And the settlement had, is a very voluminous, it's called a modified remedial order, very unsexy legal stuff. It was very voluminous and there were a lot of changes required. And so my first job was really just to figure out why haven't these changes been effective in the past? The department had tried many times, had sued and been sued and lost many times with little effect on either the process of hiring candidates or the demographics of the department. So part of my job was to implement them. And part of my job was to figure out sort of like from an anthropological perspective, why they never work. Why was this kind of constantly running up against a brick wall?
What parts of you were most excited to tackle that tangled issue?
Well, I like hard problems. Like, don't give me an easy problem that doesn't excite me, or don't send me somewhere and say, just keep the ship on a steady course. I think I'm very good at problem solving, and I like the idea of a problem that hasn't been solved before and approaching it. And I like new challenges, experiences. As much as the fire department was unexpected to me, it didn't seem like a bad idea. It sounded like a wonderful one. The brand is good. I knew what the FDNY did. And so to me, a lot of people have said that they wouldn't have said yes to that choice. But to me, I saw it as the opposite, which is the brand is fantastic. I will figure out how I can help. And if I can't help, I'll go back to City Hall. So that was a big part of it, that it was an interesting place that did good things. And I don't think you can ever really have a bad time if you work at a place that does something good. Whereas you can actually have a good job at a place that does something you don't feel good about and be pretty miserable. So I felt both interested and intrigued and sort of honored to be sent there. I'm very optimistic. I feel the government can do big things and like special things for people. So the idea of going and helping a good organization be better seemed interesting to me. And the fact that it's a kind of unique and a little bit opaque place was also intriguing to me. That was not, again, intimidating. That was interesting. A lot of what I've done in my life and career is to show up somewhere new. That's basically what a campaign is, right? You show up in like a district that you've never lived before, and you need to say to someone, here's what people care about, which means you need to go talk to people what they care about and need to learn their culture. And that was interesting to me too. It was to go learn a new place. And the fire department's about as different as you could get from City Hall.
What was your time like there?
I mean, that's a question I'm still working on answering. It was obviously the experience of a lifetime, and I never expected to stay too. As you can imagine, if someone shows up in the fire department, especially to work on something that wasn't welcomed, it was controversial, I assumed that my role would be to implement that and then leave. What was my experience like? It was eye-opening because it really is a different place with a whole different set of norms and values and people. And I found that wonderful. Like I just, found like it really opened up my world to a lot of people, many of whom are still friends. And just even a way of thinking about life that is actually much more communal than I think we're used to. And I think we need. You're never alone in the firehouse. There's no such thing as alone time. And while I'm someone who still needs a little of that, it really has changed my thinking. There's a phrase that one of our firefighters that we lost in the line of duty used to say, Tim Klein, was if you're on the fence, show up. And it sounds maybe like a sort of simple thing or maybe even an obvious thing. But when you start to look around in life, you realize how much you and the people around you, when you're on the fence, actually tend to stay home. You think, oh, I'm too busy or I need time alone. And, my opinion is every time I've ever pushed myself to show up, whatever that meant, right? Do something a little bit extra that was hard to take some care of someone who was sick, or if it's just as simple as like get out of your sweatpants and get out of your house and go to your friend's happy hour, you're always happier after. So I think maybe I would say that summarizes kind of how they changed me. But I'd also say it was a great experience. It was very complicated, as you can imagine. I don't want to hide that. Being a woman there is very challenging in some expected ways and some not expected ways. But it wasn't a bad one. It's not one I regret. It was just a challenge every day. I often compare it to if you hike a lot. It's one thing to hike a trail that's already been carved. It's still hard, right? You're still marching uphill and you're still hot and sweaty and exhausted. But it's another thing if there is no trail. It takes you 10 times as long. You often have to turn around. You have often gone the wrong way and there's a river in the way. You have to turn back. And you're often just honestly like more bloody and tired by the time you get to the top. You've been scratched and bruised and it's taken you twice as long. So I think that's maybe how I would describe it. It's just maybe being a first there, being a new type of person isn't good or bad. It's just a wholly different experience. No one's ever seen anyone like you before.
Yeah. And it sounds like it perhaps went way beyond gender in terms of that newness, that maybe this was a different mindset and approach to leadership there.
Yeah, I was asked to do a few things, and I have a lot of thoughts about whether or not we ask firsts to do this. And I think the data shows we do, is we tend to put firsts in charge of organizations when they're in crisis, and especially in this case, in crisis around the topic of race and gender, right? They were being sued by the Bush Department of Justice. So this was not a singular lawsuit. This was a very extensive federal lawsuit from the Bush administration that had been going on for many, many years. And that is a somewhat typical thing to, have like, say, a Me Too crisis and you put a woman in charge. It's a very common thing for firsts of all types to be put in charge when there's a crisis. I was also asked to be a disruptor. I was asked to specifically look at how to do things different, not just on the topic of race and gender, on technology, on data, on the way that we approached running the agency. And there's pieces of that where gender informs them, but that's not what it's all about, right? People would have resistance to something new happening in an agency where they've worked for a long time. People would have resistance to a disruptor. I think that gender can further complicate that when you look and sound different, but it's not what it's all about. I notice this all the time in the coverage of me, is the fact that I wasn't a firefighter is almost always the second line. However, the commissioner's role is a civilian role, and the vast majority of commissioners have never served in any uniform capacity, not even earlier in their career. It is a job specifically, and for a bunch of very critical management reasons, much like the commander-in-chief model, you are meant to be separate from the uniform workforce so that you can be objective and even-handed when it comes to things like discipline and spending money and managing the budget. But if you look at my male counterparts who are also not firefighters, it's almost never mentioned. And it's certainly not mentioned in the second line. It's not, oh, here's Commissioner so-and-so. He was never a firefighter, but here's all the things he did. But with me, it is. And so that's, those are the complicated ways in which gender certainly plays a role, but it's not what it's all about. It is about being different. And there's many layers of being different, and then many layers of being asked to go to an organization and ask people who've been doing the job for a really long time to do something differently. Even to this day, I don't know that I've reconciled the idea of, should we be asking women to be put in charge when something is hard? That's what I wanted. I like solving hard problems. Like I said, I don't want to be put in charge of something and be told to just keep doing the same thing. But I also acknowledge that is a much harder task, because you yourself are also new. You're a new messenger. People are already kind of going to have questions about you, or even question what you say. And, which one is better, right? Do we want to put a woman in to do effectively the job the way a man did it? Or do we want to put a woman there to ask her to do it differently? Because that's part of what, in theory, difference does, is it opens doors to new ways of doing things that you haven't thought about. That's hard. I don't know the answer.
That's such a good question. It doesn't set a trailblazer up for success. And yet, in some ways, it's what's necessary.
Yeah, it's the very thing we hope that bringing in a new voice. What I always try to say to people is, race and gender are actually sort of crude ways to look at difference, because they're so broad, right? Not everyone in those categories is the same. And we actually only use them because they're the only obvious measure of figuring out whether or not we're bringing a new experience into a place. But really what we're trying to do, irrespective of race and gender, is bring new opinions and experiences into a place. That is what the data shows diversity actually benefits organizations, including businesses, from the bottom line. They become more profitable if they have more diverse sets of points of view at the table. But the only way we know how to do that, it's very hard to suss out people's whole life stories, is to look at race and gender. And so it becomes a very complicated, question of, what are we asking people to do when we ask them to be a first? Is it just to check the box? Is it to be different? How do we support them if we know that's the case, that they're going to be very different and people are going to have a reaction to that? I will let you know if I ever get to a conclusion. But I think one thing I would say that certainly has been raised, recently because of the presidential election, that I do think is, it's the more women we have doing things, the less those questions matter. And I'm very worried that, following the presidential election, where, the Republican, their most sort of competitive female candidate, Nikki Haley, didn't, really even make it very far, and Kamala Harris did not win, that you're going to find people saying we shouldn't run female candidates. And I think that, I would say that in politics and in business and in any circle where we are thinking about why we want more women, just more women would help. Then you don't have to think about whether or not, it's this model or that model, or is it this one woman who can finally make it and all of our hopes ride on her? There's 100 male candidates for every job that exists. So, I think my overall thought would be, if you just have more women in that space, it makes it easier. There's less focus on her. There's more models to choose from. What you would want is for a business to say, we have a whole slate of female candidates, and we have some that will keep the ship running in one direction, and we'll have some that are going to change the status quo. And let's pick the best type of leader for the moment. Instead, we often only have one woman, and we're asking her to do it all.
To be everything.
That's a lot for anyone. No one can survive a petri dish, right? We're all humans. And I think that's often where we really hit a wall. Is it's like, why was this one woman not perfect? It's like, well, there are no perfect male leaders either.
Right, right. And yet the stakes are just so much higher.
Yeah.
And I think so many women right now are feeling that consciously or not.
Yeah.
And maybe a sense of hopelessness on the heels of the presidential election, on whichever side of the political divide, right? There is this sense of, is it even possible for a woman to achieve the highest office in America? And I think stories like yours, however challenging that was, can give some measure of hope to all women in all domains.
Yeah, I agree. And what I hear from, I'd say, especially my mom and her generation, is really like the very real grief that they may never see a woman president in their lifetime. Because in the cycle for both parties, the woman who seemed, if nothing else, very prepared did not make it. I hear real grief very specifically from my mom, but for her friends in general, is that maybe like that was it. Especially because the idea that people will now maybe be afraid to run women, that they may never see that in their lifetime. So I think that's a real fear. And that's why I say it's a fear of mine, but actually only in the sense that we will just stop running them because we'll want to go back to what we know wins.
To winning.
Exactly. I actually think that's short-sighted. And in campaigns, whenever you use the last strategy that won for too long, it never works out. The world keeps on moving. So as a campaign person, I'd say that actually it's not a smart campaign strategy, but it is something that happens out of fear to people. And I do understand that. So I'm thinking of it that way. And to your point, as I've said to a lot of people, part of the problem is in spaces that are so male, which the presidency is as well, right? Not just in how many men have held it, but honestly in the archetype of the role is very male.
Mm-hmm.
It does seem impossible until someone does it. And then it kind of seems like, well, that wasn't, why didn't we do that all along? So I think we have to think of it that way too. I think if you'd asked anyone in the fire department before I was appointed, the women who have worked there for many decades, including the first group of women who got in via lawsuit in 1982, many of whom I'm lucky enough to know, they would have said it'll never happen. So it does feel impossible until it's not, which is, I think, why you have to keep trying.
Yeah. I love that you say that because to me, so much of the reason to share these stories is just to create a sense of hope, because it's when we become hopeless, we stop trying.
Agreed. I don't think you can get anything done that is really hard or really new without hope, because if you think about it, forget sort of even the bigger idea of hope. You actually just have to believe something that isn't currently true. It really requires like sort of this real well of just belief that it can happen and that it's going to happen. Really sort of nothing great is conceived without that level of hope, I think, because everything that's great is new. No one's ever seen it before. So if you ask a bunch of people, can you imagine this or do you want this? They'll probably say, I don't know. You do have to be, I always have to say, you have to be wildly optimistic to want to change things, because everything that you want to change, someone has tried to change and failed 100 times before.
My dear friend Kara and I were talking about this on Friday, that the quality in ourselves that we're most grateful for is our delusional optimism.
Yeah, I often say that to people. I think it feels delusional, as in I'm not sure I can point to what drives me to consistently be optimistic, other than to say, I have been, and it usually does work out. So it feels like a good trait to have. It can feel a little bit woo-woo, like it's not based in anything. But I've always had a lot of it. Same thing with curiosity, which I think goes hand in hand with optimism, actually, which is being, rather than turned off or sort of depressed about it, is being curious why something didn't work, or being curious why someone is resistant to it, is really important for trying to get something new accomplished.
Yeah, because I think curiosity is a counter to fear.
Yeah, agreed. Very much so. It's also a counter to, we might call it polarization, but I would call it something different because it has such a political connotation. It's a counter to the idea that you are always on opposite teams. In the fire department, certainly a lot of people from the time I came in onwards had a lot of skepticism about me because I was bringing something that was not popular. And I think that the places where I won over allies or convinced someone we should do it, or at least convinced them that it needed to be done, even if they didn't like it, that, complying with a court of law would put us in a better place as an agency, was because I was curious about why they were resistant. And I think if instead I approached them as, well, I'm mad at you that you don't agree with me and we're on opposite teams and now we're fighting, I would actually never have learned where there were places for agreement. I needed to know what their real worries were in order to address them, some of which could be addressed and, some couldn't. But I think that curiosity just takes down the dial of feeling that everything we disagree about is an intractable fight.
Mm-hmm.
I find often when you dig into why you disagree with someone, you find you actually have a lot in common. You may have a different philosophy about how to fix it, but you actually have the same concern or fear or hope or worry.
Yes, 1,000 times yes. I think maybe the most dangerous thing happening in our world right now is this lack of curiosity.
Yeah.
We flatten each other.
People are kind of harder to reach because a lot of that animosity is online. So it's hard to actually get to know the person you're having this fight with. But I agree. I mean, one of the things I studied when I went back to school while I was in my job at night was disinformation and gossip and its effect on organizations. And one of the things, this predated, I went back a few years ago, but so this was, I think, before everything started happening with like Russia getting so involved in the election. But one of the core tenets of people who look at disinformation is the idea that there is an unmet fear that people need answered. And if they are not given a real answer, they will go for disinformation. They'll go for a conspiracy theory. And I've found that to be actually extraordinarily true in the fire department, that traffics in quite a bit of not helpful gossip. It's sort of a part of the interesting cultural makeup of the department. But often when I tried to get to the bottom of why they thought something so bad was happening, they had a real concern, a valid concern about their safety or their security that no one had not been asked and answered. A lack of curiosity will cause, I think, everyone to go into their corners, but also to come up with the worst possible reason that the person across from them is doing what they're doing.
Yeah. It also, I think, going back to something you said about when you entered the role, which maybe sounded a bit like, were we asking the right question about how to address this problem at this time? And I think part of where we misunderstand the power of diversity, right, is we bring in new voices and there's this belief that old voices will be silenced.
Yeah, exactly.
But the magic of diversity is bringing the new voices and the old voices together to solve problems in more holistic and thoughtful ways.
Yeah, exactly. Scarcity is one of the biggest drivers, or a sense that scarcity may come, that there will be fewer of these jobs available. There are some of the last few very good union jobs in this country. We just don't have as many of those anymore where you can raise a family on a single income. So to your point, that was one of the main things I identified from the beginning and always was a very big champion of our labor relations negotiations, because I felt that we needed to keep increasing the number of jobs available. And we needed to make sure that there was not a sense of scarcity, that as we diversify, this fixed number of jobs is going to go to fewer people that that instead we should be bringing those voices to the table. We should be expanding the number of jobs and expanding the number of different viewpoints in them, including the ones we have. The legacy viewpoints are exceptionally important in the fire department. It's a very dangerous job and you need the people who've been doing it for decades. That's a very hard thing to combat, though. People often see change as a scarcity problem, that they will be eliminated or the thing that they love will be eliminated or either much harder to access for them. And that is what creates disinformation, 100%, even in an organization, let alone kind of society-wide. You have to, from the outset, really find out what those fears are and address them.
It's been a really interesting time for diversity in general. It felt like 2020, 2021, there was a time of real action and change. And then just over the past few weeks, I feel like every week there's another big story about a major retailer or a large company rolling back all of those initiatives.
Yeah. There's a couple of things at hand. One, I feel like I have a unique perspective because part of being in a city like New York, but running an agency like the fire department is, I always call it sort of like being the ambassador between two worlds, because the culture and just the straight politics, the political spectrum in the city is very left. And the fire department is a very traditional and conservative place. And so you're often trying to negotiate not just communication, but like trying to match the needs of one to the other. And this is a case where, the city of New York, the Justice Department brought this case around diversity and believed in it. And for the most part, the rank and file of the fire department did not. So one, that is why I went back to school. That's where we get into a lot of things of, I think, where we really have to understand and not just dismiss people's concerns as being anti-women on the job or anti-people of color of the job. You really have to dig down if you want to be a solver of the problem and figure out what is it that is worrying people. And when I did that and went to the department, you really found that those concerns for the most part were around scarcity, losing really well-paying jobs, losing experience on the job, and just the way of life changing. You cannot change any organization, no matter how passionately you feel or even how offended you feel about someone with a different point of view. There is just no way to get at those issues without really talking to and caring about the humans involved and assuming that they mean the best in trying to get there. You will come across people who don't mean the best, but they're kind of obvious. And they're actually few and far between. So when you can sort that out and talk to the people who really care and have concerns, I think you can do a lot. The other thing I'd say, and I think this is starting to get well covered, is there's a distinct difference between DEI programs and actual, what I would call justice work. As in, if someone is being treated a certain way, that is just simply unacceptable. That is not DEI. It's actually just a belief in basic human rights. And I think, unfortunately, those things have been conflated. I think that's very unfortunate, because some of the things that I've seen and that we've been able to stop from happening would offend anyone. And nobody wants to see their fellow human go through. And, the last thing I would say is we always need to remember when we're looking at organizations or structures of power, that power is what is at hand. And we've seen that there's a fairly extensive coverage of the Michigan DEI programs and their failure to create any diversity at the University of Michigan. I think that was in the New York Times Magazine. And I thought that was a very, very good piece, because what it tries to sort out is the ways that power reorganizes itself in an organization versus the desires for basic human rights and justice. And in the case of the University of Michigan, all this money and power is put into DEI, so much so that DEI completely loses any connection to the original belief, which is to give people these basic human rights. And I've seen that happen in my organization as well. So I think we just have to be more honest with ourselves about how power works. And that if you're going to give millions of dollars and thousands of jobs into a program, no matter how well-meaning that program is, it will take on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. Same thing is true of breaking power structures. You can also create them that way. And that we really have to just pause for a second in a lot of organizations and make sure that what we are doing has that as its focus. We are talking about the way we treat other human beings and basic human rights. And that can and should be separate from bureaucratic compliance programs.
Yeah.
Many of which I've had a similar experience and seen simply aren't working, but we don't, there's sort of a reluctance to admit that, because the actual problem is still there and is much harder to solve. How we treat people well, sort of the essential conundrum of both every organization, but of, I think, human life.
Yeah. And so much of it is putting people into these spots saying, oh, that was a failure, but actually we didn't support the person in that role.
Yeah.
So looking back, what types of support do you believe are most important to empower success?
Yeah, I think it's many things. I think that's a really great point. I will say, and I will not mention any of their names, but one of the great things I am lucky to have been able to see into in this job is women in uniform services who are either running the uniform service or rising through the ranks. And there is one universal feeling we all have when we get together, which is that nobody really is interested in supporting you in that job, that you often feel like you were meant to check the box and then everybody moved on. And I think that's specific to uniform services because the political sort of supports don't overlap, right? It tends to be people on the left who support making these trailblazing positions, but we work in spaces that are very conservative. And so we actually find that our liberal counterparts are very loath to even really touch our world or even to hear what it's really like. It's almost an experience. I think they don't really want to know about it because they want it to all be rainbows and sunshine. And so I think that's a place, certainly in my post-government life, I want to try to work to bring those together because I don't think people mean to be so divisive, but I think that there is a feeling among, I both obviously know many women on all parts of the spectrum are very lucky in that way, but certainly in the women who work in very male-dominated spaces and particularly conservative spaces, that somehow their leadership is less relevant and less supported. So trying to change that, because I do believe the more women we put in leadership in every realm, the better we will be as a society and the faster we will see many glass ceilings get broken. So I think that's super important and a very good point. I think what I would say if I was writing sort of a playbook for how, whether it's a board of directors, a CEO, an elected official, anybody who's making a first, there's a few things. I think there's one, just simply recognizing that their experience will be different. You cannot, no matter what you do, really ask them or expect them to lead exactly like the person before them or to lead without any friction, because there just is going to be that. And I think acknowledging that from the outset and just saying to them, what do you need to do this? Because it probably will be different is important. I can't, tell you how many people I encountered who felt like, okay, you can have the exact same staff, schedule, security, which is a very interesting piece of this. You need significantly more security as a female leader. That's a well-researched fact and certainly was true for me. But understanding that totality of that experience is going to be different. And so you can't simply place that person in the spot and never ask them, what is this like for you? Which parts are different that we can adjust? That's one. I would say two, extremely importantly, is making sure that the people who communicate for them have been trained and understand that the effort is going to be very different, that the way that that woman is going to be perceived in the public sphere is going to be different. And you're going to have to fight for her in different ways, shape the narrative about her in different ways. Again, of all the women I meet with, that's almost the number one thing that comes up as a concern. And it's everything from, the pictures that are posted about me. People don't think about the fact that, my skirt might have been twisted and is showing a little bit of leg, and you can't put that online because you will get these not only atrocious comments, but it actually changes people's point of view. If you it suddenly casts you as a woman and not as a leader. So it goes from things that seem that superficial, but that's a constant with women leaders, is the idea that people are not conscientious about how they show you, to really substantial things about the fact that I mentioned in the beginning that every single article about me, the second line is that I wasn't a firefighter when none of my colleagues had been either. But somebody has to be conscientious that that is something they're going to have to fight against, that they might have to do more work on your bio, on putting you out there and showing that you're qualified for the job you're doing. So I think really being conscientious that the woman will be perceived differently. And so different, tactics and strategies are needed. And then same thing, I think, just with, what you're asking her to do, is being very conscious of being not only upfront about that, but understanding where is that going to be more difficult for her? Where will her gender, maybe make it easier, make it harder, or just will shape the narrative differently? So you kind of know what battle you're going into together. I really do believe that we don't do enough to help people understand what they're asking someone to do when they ask them to be a first. There's some very concrete ways we actually can support them better. We have to be willing. We can't just think that we're checking a box and move on.
Yeah, it has to go a lot further than that. And I love the steps you outlined because I can hear immediately how they apply across domains.
Yeah. I was very lucky in many ways. And one of them was I had the second in command job for, I think, almost 5 years before I became commissioner. And that gave me an opportunity to see firsthand what was happening to women, in particular, what was happening to firsts. And I went back to school to actually try to unpack why that was. And so I think for me, it helped me not only prepare, but it also helped me understand what was going to happen to me if I ever was in the public eye. And I think that, if anything, that's one of the things also I think we need to do for women is some of it's really scary. You get threats, you get called terrible things. And for many of us who've worked very hard to be overqualified for our jobs, you're suddenly, doubted, often called a DEI hire. It's a very common insult. And so, I think that because I knew that would happen, I wouldn't say that it wasn't hard, but I knew that it wasn't personal. And I think that for a lot of women, there's a ton of data that women serve in corporate CEO roles for less time, that female politicians serve less long tenures than their male counterparts. And I think it's because not only is a lot of that hard, but you often don't expect it, especially if you are a woman who's worked really hard and you've been through a lot of these levels and you know the job, and you really can't imagine that if you suddenly have a new title, people that are going to treat you substantially different, and that the outside world may be substantially more critical of you than you've ever expected. So I think preparing women, it sounds terrible, right? I'd like to tell the women, oh, it's going to be a great experience, but I'd be lying. It is hard in ways that are common to all leaders. And then it's hard in ways that are very specifically gendered. A lot of the insults in the comments are very specifically gendered. Rape threats against public officials who are women is a very common thing. So I think preparing women for that is really important, so that when it happens to them, they can feel some separation between that cruelty and it being personal, because it isn't. It happens to every woman in public life, of every political persuasion, and in every sector, corporate, public, etc.
Wow. This idea of normalizing those challenges feels really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. It's really shocking when it happens to you and you don't know that it's not about you.
Yeah.
It's really shocking when it happens, I should say, period. But we saw this happen a lot. We would feature female firefighters during different things on our social media. And I often, as the commissioner, you're not talking to each person who's going on social media, right? That's something that sort of happens far away from you. But what started coming back is women saying, I had no idea that this is what people would say under my photo. Like, I've been a firefighter for 20 years. I have no political opinions. I'm just doing my job, and I'm going into this post just to show people what it's like to do my job, because I care about this profession and want to inspire others to follow it. And they would be asked, to be taken off social media because it was so cruel. Because it wasn't about them. It was people applying their lens, their politics. And so we had to start, I really had to encourage my team not only to approach that differently, but with many of those women, I called them and spoke to them directly. They needed to hear from someone like me, even though that's somewhat unusual in a paramilitary organization that you would hear from your boss. But who else was going to be able to say it? It wasn't the people in that office who were largely male. So I often spoke to some of them directly to say, this isn't about you. You have every right to not want to go through it if you want to be taken down. But also, I just want you to know that this is what happens to me every day and has nothing to do with you. There's nothing you could do to control it. It is people with other goals and aims using you as a pawn.
Yeah. And as women, the research shows we are more likely to internalize anger and blame than men who externalize. That's why this point to me feels so vital, because our tendency as women is often to say, what did I do wrong? Oh, I shouldn't have worn my skirt twisted, right? Instead of, look, as a team, we need to take responsibility for this.
Yeah. We're given those messages our whole life, right? And also some of them, as a woman, you're always fighting the idea that you shouldn't have to care about that, but you do, right? So not only we are given these messages, but I'm sure you, as I did growing up, had to cover my drink and never leave it alone and consider whether or not I wanted to wear a certain outfit out. So it's not only that people tell us those things, it's actually that to keep ourselves safe, we're always thinking about how to not make someone else mad.
Yes.
And, that's a really, really deep thing to think about. I would say, I've told some of my male friends about how women negotiate talking to men at bars. Like, not men they're on a date, but someone who approaches you, and how often that experience ends with like some amount of violence when you reject them. And it's simple as, you're out with your girlfriends, someone comes over, he says, I'd like to buy you a drink. And you say, no, I'm on girls' night out. I'm not talking about some lengthy, complicated human experience. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on this podcast, but the number of times that a man will then call you a bitch are, I would say, over 50%. And so like, that's just one small story, but I think it is the sort of way that as a young woman, you begin to learn that not making men mad is a matter of survival.
Mm-hmm.
And we really internalize that, right? So I think you're totally right to your point. We tend to always think that something is our fault, that we did something wrong. Even if we think the thing should be okay, we still try to look for, how did I cause this? I'd say that's true for myself. Despite whatever toughness and data and all the things we've talked about that I learned to get myself to this place, it doesn't mean that I am not often like, if I had just done X, would this have been easier for me? That's always a thought. It's still a thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can maintain that level of curiosity and openness with others while also actively demotivating ourselves with self-blame and recrimination.
Yeah. I also think, one of the things that's so important in leaders in this day and age is authenticity. And I think this is another place where women really struggle. I think we all struggle, but again, I think women have an additional complicated layer here, which is that because your personal life and that authenticity has so many ways of going wrong, that the type of person you date can be fodder for gossip, right? The type of person you don't date can be fodder for gossip. Even just your sex life is more of greater curiosity to people and also of greater like shame and blame than it is for men. You hear this over and over with women who run for political office. And this is definitely true of both Kamala Harris and Nikki Haley, that they're often called like too like rigid or closed off, or I don't really know who they are, or I don't know if I could have a beer with them. And people kind of dismiss that as important. And I again, as a campaign person, it's not, authenticity is important, but I also have so much empathy because just like them, I have learned to not talk about my personal life, not talk about, certain things that I do in my free time, because it has been such a painful point of criticism. And often it's, for whatever reason, not seen as a point of bonding the same way I see it with my male colleagues, where talking about the crazy night out that you had is a way to be closer as it is with your friends. But if I walked into the office and talked about my girls' night out, forget it. It would be all about what I wore or what I did. And that would be a story in the newspaper the next day. So I think there's a really hard line for female leaders to cut around being authentic when so much of your experience coming up the ranks shows you that being authentic made you vulnerable in a way that was bad, caused people to critique who you were or just to be mean, right? Like, I don't post much on my own personal social media, and that's probably bad. I need to create a brand and all these things that people do in modern life. But honestly, it's after 5 years of being online and that everything I post is like, not only has mean comments, but just bizarre theories about my life, that my family is secretly rich and bought me the job, which couldn't be less true and causes my parents to like laugh very hard. But it causes you to just move away from being open in public life. And that's hard because then people also want you to be authentic and you want to be. How you get there is harder. And I have a lot of empathy and even pushback when people say that they don't kind of like really know who a woman is, because I think it's a defense mechanism she almost certainly had to build to get where she is. So then how do you take it down once you're there?
Right. And I think then to your original point, this becomes a question of volume. The only way through this is to have enough equity that it's normalized.
Yeah, exactly. Where it shouldn't be so of such piqued curiosity, like what a woman does in her personal life, right? I actually think this is a really great place where Gen Z is making some inroads that are very curious to me. And I think Call Her Daddy, the number one people, and this makes me crazy, the number one women's podcast, which I'm not sure why we have to put it that way. I don't know if you've ever watched it, but the reason that's so interesting to me is those women are leading from a place, like Hot Mess is one of their podcasts, right? The idea of being messy is actually what they're trying to lead with. And even though like they're much younger than me and much cooler, and I don't necessarily relate to their lives at this point, I do actually see that as being a huge change. That was not true for me. It is not true for my mom's generation that you could be messy and succeed. So for them to be changing that idea, that to be messy, to talk about your sex life and romance and relationships and all the things that all of us in our 20s go through and, beyond. I'm not saying that stops in your 20s, but, the wild times out, normalizing that so that people don't turn around and be like, oh, that one woman, she's so this or she's so that, and really loving them for that. It gives me hope that, when they are in the places like that I am, when someone is a corporate executive 10 years from now, the idea that a woman lives as messy and strange as a life as a man does will actually be normal because they are making it normal. They're putting it out there without fear, which I watch those and I'm like, I wish, like, if I could wish for a magic trait, it would be to be that comfortable talking about my life. Because really, I've been taught my whole life to put those things aside. And I think it's contributed to my success is the ability to put those things aside. But I love that they're changing that as a norm. It makes me optimistic.
That's an incredible point. And I think it relates directly to this idea that we have to dimensionalize human beings in order to find connection. And it's the flattening is the danger. And so we flattened women as these one-dimensional people who don't make anybody mad, but just make things better.
Yeah.
As opposed to just human beings who are making things better.
Yeah. 100%. And you see that with a lot of men who have done something wrong in the public space, people coming out and saying, but he had a rough upbringing or this or that. What they're doing is dimensionalizing him. I'm not going to take any one man because that's not fair. But what I would say is all people deserve forgiveness and a chance at redemption. And all people deserve to be multidimensional. But you can't even get there if people won't let you be dimensional, right? And probably some of those men deserve that forgiveness and some do not. But it should be the same thing with women. And there is, again, a lot of research around that the idea that it's not that men or women do things wrong at a higher, greater rate. Yes, we'd all love to say women are perfect leaders and not the men. That would obviously be very self-serving. But actually, just all people are messy and flawed and trying to do their best. And some people make mistakes and apologize and actually do make amends, and some people don't. But you really can't do that if you aren't multidimensional. And that's the thing I think we are often giving to men is the chance to say who they really are and at least make an appeal on whether or not they deserve to be considered in that way for both their flaws and their positive qualities. And we definitely do not do that with women. I always call it the petri dish. It's be perfect, be under a microscope, be perfect. And even in the ways that perfection is annoying, that you don't tell me what your personal life is like, or you don't tell me about your girls' night out, there's always some way in which that's wrong because we're not multidimensional. And that is what I see in those Gen Z folks who are coming up is an ability to make a woman multidimensional. Alex Cooper is both messy and extremely successful. And I love that.
And extremely smart.
Yes. And I like that to me feels more, it may have moved us forward further for her to simply make that idea well known than almost anything I can think of.
That is a rad idea. I think
I'd like to be messy, but it's hard to go backwards at this point in my life.
I mean, I looked around for podcasts where people were talking to Laura Kavanagh to do my homework, and I didn't find many.
I will say this is probably, again, a space I can learn from the younger women. I've always been very shy and very reserved. And so I only did when I was working what was required for my job. And a lot of that, you'll find a lot more of me on TV talking about fires and disasters because that was my job. Testifying in front of Congress, things that frankly are not very sexy. That's sort of, I think, where I specialize. Not that that's the brand I want, but because I was shy and I was reserved and also I did see the risks in putting myself out there, I did not do that. And some of it's just time. The job like that is so all consuming. You really don't have time to do the other. But I certainly think in my post-government life, which is part of why I reached out to you, right? We never had time to do this because not only was I so busy, but it did always fall to the bottom because it wasn't about what the emergency was right now.
The critical piece.
And that is almost always the job of the fire commissioner. So it's a long ways between me and being a hot mess for Alex Cooper, but this is my start.
Maybe a first step. And yeah. So what are you up to these days?
So I did the thing that both nobody believes and also nobody ever actually does, even though they say they're going to do, which is I actually just took 6 months off. So I think gone for about 3 months now. I traveled the world. My passport is gone from nearly blank because I hadn't, because of COVID and the tie to the city, I hadn't really left since 2019. So I traveled the world. My passport has lots of stamps. I went to see my family, which is very spread out. Our family has many branches. New York is home for me, but there is no such as thing. Sometimes people say, are you going to like where your family is from or home? And I always laugh because that would require a passport and a lot of more airplane miles than anyone has. But I did my best to go see as many of them as possible, spent some time with my parents, which I had not done in some time. And honestly, just took time, to your point, took time to rebuild my community is what I'd say. And I would say rebuild. They've been there for me all along, but I felt like I was in a deficit. Like I had been borrowing money, which is in their time and attention and care, and not able to give it back. Right. I was the person who, if you were having a birthday party, I'd show up, but I'd show up for 20 minutes after this meeting and before the next one. Or I had friends who had kids who I had not had a chance to see yet, let alone get to know and babysit. And so I've been doing that, which is no one believes me. There's lots of interesting rumors about that one too. One, that I'm secretly pregnant, which I'm not. Two, that I fled New York because of the investigations with the Southern District, which has nothing to do with me, luckily. So shows you how, again, being not very public can create some real strange misinformation. Mm-hmm. But actually, I've just been having a great time. I need to get back to the drawing board. I did teach before I was in the job, and I will probably go back to, I definitely want to go back to teaching. I do want to write. So I'm going to write a book at some point. There's some things I definitely need to turn my attention to being a responsible adult again. But for the last few months, it has been truly a commitment to making up for lost time.
I think that balance is, again, underestimated in terms of its importance to sustaining motivation, to keep doing really hard, meaningful things.
Yeah. I think this is true of all leaders. I've never met a leader for whom this either wasn't true, or if it wasn't, that substantially harmed their career and their ability to stay in the job, which is you need a community. You need a really good one. And it has to be separate from your work. And that's actually really hard because a lot of us, like some of our best friends, right, we meet at work. But when you have that kind of job where you are the boss of everyone, you need a place where you can go and actually be messy, right? One-on-one. You have to say, I had a hard day. I think I messed something up. I don't feel good. I'm grumpy, whatever. And have people that are not only going to lift you up, but also going to be honest, that you can have an honest sounding board on how you're doing, but are also going to, take you out and make you laugh and revive you. So really, I think to survive, not just as a person, but honestly, to be a good leader, to show up 100% for the people who work for you, you can't come in tired and grumpy every day. And so really realizing how much I had asked of people while I was in the job, I really felt like I needed to kind of go back to that. And this is another place that feels gendered, but just that we, I think as women, do not feel we are allowed to take a break. Honestly, there's a lot of evidence that we're greatly criticized. And that was certainly true. I went to have a medical procedure, one that I'd say is very common and very unpleasant. And I will just leave it there, but like almost everyone has had. And someone wrote an article saying I was missing in action because something happened while I was in the hospital. And it was being a person who takes care of myself and doing something that most people have to get done every few years as they reach their 40s. And that's an example, to me, a small one, but it happened a lot. And I've heard it from other female leaders where you also really end up putting in 100% because you understand the amount of scrutiny on you means that you can't necessarily take as much downtime without being accused of somehow working less hard.
Yeah. The stakes and the standards are so much higher.
Yeah. I think it's, again, why female leaders tend to serve shorter tenures in any job. I'm not even saying that like, oh my gosh, it's so atrocious. Maybe we all should be serving. Maybe there should be term limits on being a leader because it is exhausting. But it's certainly like there just is this, there's a significant
breaks, at least.
A little like hiatus, sabbatical, but it's in the data and it's in the data strongly in every sort of leadership career that women serve shorter terms. And I think all of these things contribute to it, right? If it's if there's more focus on you every day and you have to be more 100% every day, and you get some sort of like strange and mean feedback on a regular basis, it's just going to burn you out faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, I mean, as you think about the effects of fatigue in general, and those are so well researched that being blackout drunk basically has the same empowerment on our brains as being blackout tired.
Yeah.
Which so many leaders are. And I use that often as reinforcement and a reminder that we have to take care of ourselves, because as women, especially, we are asked to play so many roles societally in our families, on a personal level, professional level. It's too much if we let it be too much. I'm really glad, Laura, that you're taking care of yourself.
It took a while, so don't give me too much credit. It was 5 to 10 years of exhausting myself, but I think or hope a lesson learned for other people. And especially for that idea that you actually can.
I hope you keep telling your story too.
I will. You can tell me who to talk to next. But especially for that idea of really taking time off, again, normalizing that, for there to be so many doubts and sort of like conspiracy theories around me actually taking time off shows you how unusual that is. People simply couldn't believe it. And what I said to them when they'd say things like that, I'd say, you had no idea how tired I was. I'm not complaining. You just clearly, if you think it was weird, you didn't know sort of the debts to both my own health, but also to my friends and family that I had put myself in. I could not have gone to another job straight out of this one and been a sane or happy person that people wanted to be around.
I talk a lot about raising courage capital, and I think this is the other side of it, is to raise courage capital means to repay some of those debts, sometimes to those who inform and inspire our courage.
Yeah. It's hard to say to someone, I don't know if like, I'm sorry is certainly not what my friends are looking for. My friends were like, we loved this for you and we felt like we were in it together. But being able to say like, I owe you something, or I wasn't the best friend I could be and now I want to be, takes a lot of courage. People generally don't do it.
I'm really glad we got to talk.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you for hanging out with me today. And I truly mean that. I hope you tell your story more. The story you're sharing, while incredibly specific, is entirely universal.
Yeah, I agree. Like one of the biggest mistaken things people have about leaders is that they were born that way, that there's something unique and special about them, or even that they sort of woke up looking like the person you see on TV. They know all their talking points and they have it together and they know how to do their makeup. And not only has never been true of me, but having been lucky enough to meet a lot of people who I probably thought that about at some point, I can tell you that nobody does. Nobody wakes up that way. Every leader, for the most part, looks around and says like, wow, how did I become this person? Because there's a person in an earlier and not that long ago part of my life who never could have done this. So to your point, they're all very universal things. There is not a huge difference. But part of leadership and putting on that polish often, I think, makes people think those people are unique in some way that they're not, in my experience. There's humans.
Yeah, I think we all have that within us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just need the courage to show up for the hard stuff and to keep showing up for it. And we need stories that help us believe that we can do that.
Yeah, I agree.
So glad we got to do this.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Uplifters podcast. If you're getting a boost from these episodes, please share them with the Uplifters in your life, and then join us in conversation over at the uplifterspodcast.com. Head over to Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast, and follow, and rate our show. It'll really help us connect with more uplifters, and it'll ensure you never miss one of these beautiful stories. Mwah! Big love.
Painted water sunshine with rosemary and thyme. Dwell in the perplexing, though you find it vexing. Toss a star and hover, be your own best lover. Relish in a new prime, plant a tree in springtime. Dance with idle hindsight, bring the sun to twilight. Lift you up, whoa. lift you up. Whoa, lift you up. Whoa, lift you up. Lift you up. Whoa, lift you up. Whoa, lift you up. Whoa, lift you up.
Beautiful.
I cried. It's that little thing you did with your voice.
Right, in the pre-chorus, right?
I was like,
Mommy,
I had to cry
stop.
quietly.
Mommy, stop crying. You're disturbing the peace.